everybody for coming. This is really great. So Eden sent me some questions in advance, and I'm going to try to hit some of them, but I'm afraid I won't get to all of them. So please bring them up in the discussion or write down your questions. Um, and I should start by saying that the ideas in the books are not my ideas alone. They were developed in two dues-supported groups of feminist radicals, National Women's Liberation and Red Stockings. Red Stockings is a key group in getting abortion legalized in New York State in 1970, 3 years before Roe, and has continued to show the history of how we actually won abortion rights in the years since, which has been crucial to some struggles that I've been involved in, knowing that history. And then National Women's Liberation is best known perhaps for a 10-year campaign to win morning after pill to be over the counter in the US. And we worked on that from 2003 to 2013. And the idea was to make it available without a prescription. Dozens of countries already had this when we started, but like due to our campaigning and our lawsuit, the FDA finally recommended making the pill over the counter for all ages. And Barack Obama had recently become president, and that administration overruled it. And Obama said he didn't want his young daughters to be able to buy this pill, which was crazy to us. We were really surprised that the Obama administration joined the attack on the morning after pill. You know, we grumble about the Democratic Party, but it still seemed to largely support reproductive rights. And here we were talking about a contraceptive. So that, like, when we started the campaign, I was working for the Red Stockings Women's Liberation Archives, and we launched a project to examine more closely how it had happened that opposition to birth control had become mainstream again. So the books are a product of that, and some of our struggles around abortion. So we looked at the history of birth control in the United States, and we also looked at the drop in US birth rate and some of the establishment's reactions to it. And then we looked at the situation in other countries and our own experience of having and raising kids or deciding not to. And we came to some conclusions that I'll share those with you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. So for decades, we've been told that abortion is just this wedge issue. It's used by Republicans to split working class Catholics from the Democratic Party and to excite an evangelical base. And according to this view, the politicians, the 1%, don't really care one way or the other about abortion. They're just using the issue to get our votes, or to get the votes of people who are anti-abortion. So, you know, you've probably heard this over and over, like Thomas Frank, What's the Matter with Kansas? That book was very much in that vein. This explanation has frayed as we got more and more abortion restrictions over the last couple decades, and now I think it can be retired completely, as we now have abortion is entirely illegal in 12 states, and we have pitched battles in several more to try to keep it legal. So, and then these same people who are attacking our abortion rights are attacking birth control, as we can now see. And that kind of reveals that this stated goal of reducing abortions is basically a ruse, because even among people who are opposed to abortion, 80% are for birth control. So there's no grassroots clamor to end birth control. It's not coming from the grassroots in any way. So our conclusion is that abortion is basically being wrongly classified as this cultural issue where it's just a cat fight among the population, and the ruling class doesn't really care. And so we are trying to talk about how this is really, what is really underlying this. And what we say is that the bearing and raising children, who will do it and who will pay for it, is actually a key economic battlefront, and it matters a lot to the corporate leaders and the owners in our society. So one piece of evidence that we have for this is that establishment think tanks are in a froth because the US birth rate is the lowest it has ever been. It's 1.64 children per woman, which is considerably below what they call replacement, which is required for a stable population at 2.1 children per woman. And without immigration, the population in the US would soon start declining, as it has in Japan and now in Europe. And in fact, economists like Paul Krugman and Larry Summers, former head of the Treasury, blame the decades of economic stagnation in Japan on its declining population. And they talk about this as like a warning sign, right? And then in 2017, then House Speaker Paul Ryan made headlines for saying, we need to have higher birth rates in this country, and that this was as he was preparing an attack on Social Security. But he was basically saying what establishment think tanks and policy analysts have been arguing for decades. The New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal are regularly warning that if birth rates continue to slide, the result will be economic stagnation and national decline, right? And then we've heard racist versions of this bursting through. In my home state, in Florida, Republican State Senator Dennis Baxley in 2019 said, oh, Alabama's abortion ban would be good because it would encourage white births. And then recently in Illinois, when she was introducing Donald Trump, Congresswoman Mary Miller thanked him for this historic victory for white life. She later said she meant right to life, but she's just one of many who are saying the quiet part out loud, right? So we also looked at why the birth rate has gotten so low. And so to do this, we did consciousness raising in our group, National Women's Liberation. That's where we compare our experiences and then analyze them and draw conclusions. And we found that a lot of this, it was really a surprise, even though we were talking about this regularly in the group, when we got together and really focused on it, we found a lot of us either weren't having kids or were stopping at one kid because of the lack of time, money, healthcare, housing. We didn't have paid family leave. Our spouses worried about these things too. And, you know, many of us like wanted larger families, like, you know, had sisters or siblings, didn't really feel like it was a real, but stopped at one because the reality of having a kid in this society where you have so little support just came down on us like a ton of bricks. So it's not surprising that fewer people are willing to have children, given the decline in living standards that has been supported by both the Republicans and the corporate-oriented Democrats. But it does put these economic planners and these political and corporate leaders in a bind. If they want to increase the birth rate voluntarily, they're going to have to put some resources into, like, universal childcare, say, or paid parental leave. They'll have to pay livable wages and give us working hours that don't extend into the weekend, and take all our evenings. And actually, over the last couple of years, we've even seen some motion on these items, although we didn't really win anything, right? So some of the Build Back Better plan had a little bit of this in it. And then Bernie's $1.3 trillion bill, which of course went nowhere in the Senate, but had a really good package for families. Of course, there's a much cheaper way to boost the birth rate, and that's by taking away our reproductive liberty. And here, the most effective target over the centuries has been birth control, because most people will get abortions, even in like Poland, where abortion has been banned since the fall of communism. They really haven't been able to raise the birth rate by banning abortion. But our experience in the United States is that making birth control harder to get has been effective. And over the years, this accounts for why we've had a higher birth rate. Like in Texas in 2011, they made some rules that closed 82 family planning clinics in one area of Texas. and childbearing rose 27% compared to the areas that still had birth control access. So that kind of gives you an idea of like what is the impact of some of these laws on people. Europe has been ahead of us in low birth rates, but there, where they talk about it openly, there are stronger labor movements and labor parties, and they do a lot better job of representing working people's interests. And politicians generally have reacted to the lower birth rates by providing substantial paid leave, like 480 days in the case of Sweden. So, you know, it makes our request for 3 months seem really paltry. And then universal child care, monthly payments to parents, ample sick leave, shortened work hours, like until your kid is like 7, you can shorten your work hours and you are guaranteed your job. Other things that parents in the US can only dream about. And of course, they already had national health care systems. And in France and Sweden, where they really put an investment into this, the birth rate did rise modestly. But more importantly, parents and kids had less stress and better lives, right? And here in the US, stress is epidemic as the expense of bearing and raising kids is being pushed back into families to be paid out of our wages, which are already strained. And so while workers in over 50 countries have 6 months or more of paid leave, many of us in the US aren't even covered by the unpaid leave laws. And on top of this, our work hours are longer than those in Europe. So like we work 10 weeks a year more than German workers, just on average. So the decision to start a family is weighed down by all of these things, and we can see it in our own lives. So we call this resulting lower birth rate a spontaneous birth strike in response to bad reproductive working conditions. Now, obviously, some people don't want to ever have kids. That's fine. But when people who do want to have kids can't even afford to do it, that the society is definitely like broken down in a way. But the thing is, most people blame themselves if they want kids and they can't make it work. They think it's something they did wrong. Oh, why couldn't I get a better job? I went into so much debt going to school. Maybe I could move somewhere closer to my parents so they could help with childcare. Maybe I could get, you know, it's my fault for not finding affordable housing. We generally don't see it as a system that requires our unpaid reproductive labor to function. We sort of blame ourselves, much the way we blame ourselves when we can't find a job, rather than seeing it as a system that generates unemployment for its own benefit. So that's why we think it's important to expose that this anti-abortion right is really the enforcement arm of an economic system that pushes the costs and burdens of childbearing and childrearing into families and relies on our unpaid labor. And I should point out that lower birth rates are not a crisis for the 99%. Like, we'd be fine if population gently declines. But for the corporate establishment, it's a real problem. Their profits and capitalist growth in general has relied on a continually expanding workforce replenished with ever larger cohorts of young people to labor and consume and pay taxes and be recruited to the military, right? And from the inception of the system, it's relied on growth, which is led by population growth. And, you know, they discuss how if they want to get rid of Social Security, which they do, and my home state senators, both Republican senators are leading on this, Rick Scott and Marco Rubio. What they say is that people will have to have larger families than we're having now, so we can be forced to rely on our kids when we get too old to work, right? So this is the situation that we had before we got Social Security. Now, immigration, of course, has compensated somewhat for slumping birth rates in the United States, and politicians and employers discuss immigration as a way to dump the work and expense of raising the next generation onto families, communities, and nations that the immigrants leave behind. So they're actually honest about this if you read some of their pamphlets and books. But this is a reverse of the incessantly promoted idea that immigrants are lucky to be here. Oh, they should be so grateful. In fact, basically what's happening is that the sending countries are subsidizing the US's stingy family policies, all for the benefit of US employers. So families in Mexico, the state in Mexico is subsidizing when immigrants come here, is subsidizing that production of people, all for the benefit of US employers. And now, like, some of even the pro-immigration Republicans are freaking out a little bit. Like, Jeb Bush wrote a book called Immigration Wars a few years ago, and they have been actually freaking out about dropping birth rates in sending countries. So, for example, in Mexico, the birth rate has gone from 3.47 births per woman in 1990 to 2.1 today. We've seen similar drops in, like, the Philippines and in India. And in fact, 2/3 of the world now lives in countries with birth rates below replacement. So, and then as we can be really aware, especially if we're in the front line of labor struggles, immigration carries its own political liabilities for the employing class, right? Immigrants may organize against mistreatment, unionize, vote. And you can really see how corporate leaders are worried about this, because, like, compare the political situation in two states that are now majority people of color, right? California and Texas. In California, immigrant labor organizing has really changed the politics of the state. Whereas in Texas, what's happened is they've done this frantic gerrymandering and terrorizing immigrant communities, and that's kept a right-wing government in charge, barely. And you can see why this is important to oligarchs in Texas if you just look at the fact that, like, the minimum wage in California is actually twice that of Texas at this point, not to mention environmental regulations, better labor law, some paid leave, and a lot of other things. Not nearly what we need, but certainly enough to annoy the bosses, right? So that's one of the factors that they're thinking about with immigration. So we believe we'll be stronger in the abortion fight when we recognize that the battle is not really at its base a battle over religion or prudishness or to punish women for having sex or political machinations, but it's really over our reproductive labor and how cheaply that work is going to be done. And that along with that, if we understand that the corporate power structure is not like this neutral arbiter, they actually have an interest in the outcome of this fight. That means that the enemy is not ordinary people who think abortion is wrong. It's the power structure which is determined to get our work for cheap, both at home and on the job. So we think that a fresh feminist angle showing how attacks on abortion rights and birth control access are about keeping reproductive labor cheap, we can reach additional people in this fight, because a lot of people have only been exposed to kind of this feminism of the 1%, which says that any problems you have supporting and raising your kids are your personal responsibility. Why aren't you doing better? Go back to school. What's wrong with you? But our argument is we're not dumb or brainwashed for having kids. It's important, difficult work that benefits the whole society. And we need the resources to be able to do it. And this is why we say that abortion is our right to strike against untenable reproductive working conditions. So we think it's better to defend it on that basis rather than this individual choice, individualism rhetoric that's everywhere. And one way that we can do this is we can confront this neoliberal framing of childbearing as this individualist project at which should only be undertaken by families who can afford to do it, right? We've all heard this kind of rhetoric, so it may be so much that it just washes over us. But here's an example from the Washington Post. A columnist named Catherine Rampell. She says, quote, "Giving low-income women more control over their fertility promotes economic security, educational attainment, income mobility, and more stable environments for American children." So basically, she's prescribing birth control when what is required is higher pay, union jobs, affordable housing, free education, universal health care, and childcare, right? And then she continues, children brought into the world before their parents were financially or emotionally ready for them are likewise disadvantaged before they're even born, no matter how loved they are. Now, here she's basically insulting the half the country that doesn't have $500 for an emergency, right? Who is like financially ready to have kids in a situation where your healthcare is tied to your job? If you lose your job, you lose your healthcare, and the system is not set up to support families, right? So so this is just I think we really need to argue with that every time we start to hear it happening. We should really tell these neoliberal ghouls where to stick it. But mostly we need to organize a broad front to fight for all the things we need. And some threats from the left have inched the Democratic establishment forward on childcare and family allowances, as I mentioned before. And then in December, last December, the Food and Drug Administration removed some of the red tape restricting the abortion pill. And then due to some organizing over the last decade, several states have added laws to protect abortion rights. So, you know, there has been a couple of victories in all of this. And then it's kind of remarkable, like our organizing, including Bernie's run, where he really pushed the Democratic Party on abortion. You wouldn't hear it from neoliberal feminists, but that they, for the first time, they came out against the Hyde Amendment, just trying to get it in front of Bernie, who had been against it for his whole life. The Hyde Amendment, which bans federal funds for abortion and means Medicaid doesn't cover it. And then, you know, every Democratic senator except Joe Manchin has now gone on record for the Women's Health Protection Act, which is not everything we need, but it would expand abortion access in states that have accumulated oppressive laws and make abortion legal throughout the country. So we think that this understanding would help us recruit people to the fight, and a lot of people only think that sort of feminism of the 1% is feminism, and because that's the one that's promoted incessantly in the newspapers and on TV. So we think that you know, getting it back to some of these issues would really help. So what would a winning strategy look like? Our movement, with a few exceptions, has really been running based on the false narrative of how we won expanded abortion rights in the United States starting in the 60s. We basically been told ad nauseum that the Supreme Court gave us abortion rights. And so through the decades, the bulk of organizing has focused on legal cases and lobbying. And it's been kind of this apologetic, timid, respectable approach that you would expect when your main audience is judges and legislators and grant administrators, rather than thinking, how do we organize the masses of people to defend this right or expand it? And one example of this is the movement really has doubled down on the right to privacy. Abortion is a private decision between you and your doctor. And in fact, it was public truth-telling about abortion that gave the movement its strength in the 60s. What happened was that in 1968, women who were involved in the broader left movement, from civil rights to the anti-war movement, started meeting without men and comparing their experiences, and which they called consciousness raising, and it opened up a whole new battlefront, basically demanding women's liberation. And one of the things they discovered was that many of them had had illegal abortions, and they never told anybody about it. So the New York women's liberation group Red Stockings decided to go public with this information in 1969. First, they disrupted a legislative reform hearing. So this was a panel of male liberals who wanted to change the law, but only to create exceptions for rape and health of the mother. The feminist radicals disrupted this hearing by standing up and testifying about their own abortions. They went on for like 30 minutes, and finally they were locked out of the hearing. And then they organized their own hearing. It was a speak out consisting of a panel of a dozen women testifying about their illegal abortions. At a time, it was still illegal. So there's the stigma, but also you could get fired from your job, frozen out of your family, you could get kicked out of school. So breaking that silence, breaking the stigma, making these things public had an electrifying effect and mobilized a growing women's liberation movement to demand full repeal of the law in New York, which they got a partial victory in 1970, 3 years before Roe. State made abortion legal in the first 2 trimesters if a doctor did it. But and we got there and eventually got Roe through giant marches, breakups of hearings, speakouts all over the country, disruptions, class action lawsuits, abortion referral services on every major campus, so referring for illegal abortions, clergy defying the law and getting arrested, for referring for abortions, doctors openly defying the law and getting arrested. And abortion was just part of the broad radical demands of the women's liberation movement, and the general freedom struggle which was going on at the time, right? To end the war in Vietnam, for Black liberation, for worker health and safety, farm workers, Latino, Asian, and American Indians rising up, Puerto Rican organizing, forcing changes on many fronts. It was a result of all of this and more that the Supreme Court, after dithering around for a year, finally decided to take action on this Texas case, Roe versus Wade, in January of 1973, and they based it on the New York law. But the decision was always a compromise with the feminist demand for free abortion on demand and repeal of all abortion restrictions. And ever since Roe, they've been narrowing it down, and the first and most important narrowing was they allowed the federal government to basically say, we're not going to pay for any abortions. So Medicaid and other things that get federal money, like the military, the Indian Health Service, to this day won't pay for your abortion. Some states have Medicaid covered under their abortion systems, but no federal money can be used. Now, it's important to remember that Roe was decided in the middle of a different kind of population panic. This was this exceptional 20-year period from the mid-50s to the mid-70s in which the ruling class, probably for the first time in history, was actually panicking about overpopulation. This is the era of the population bomb. They complained about overcrowding and crime. They blamed urban rebellions and left mobilizations, and even blamed revolutions on rising populations. So they were pushing birth control on developing nations like India and on their colonies, like in Puerto Rico. But this panic dissipated around 1975 as the birth rate dropped. And then their concerns changed back to like what I talked about before, standard concern of ruling classes throughout history for higher birth rates. So in a way, we are up against a much more united power structure on this issue, but also due to our organizing, abortion has much more public support than it did even in 1973, as we can see from the outrage that overturning Roe has generated. So just to wrap up, this means, given the powerful array of enemies against us, the only way that we're going to win this, we can't just win it as feminists. We have to win it as a united front with, for other things that the working class needs, from unions to the higher minimum wage, to healthcare, to guaranteed paid leave, childcare, schools, investment in the public sector. If we think about abortion and birth controls as our right to demand better conditions for raising kids, you can see how it fits in with all of these other things. So, so I'll stop there, and I have a few more thoughts, but I'll let you all kick off a discussion.